second session here. Just kind of a little bit of a recap from our first session of the throne room, and which we talked about, and I called it the invitation, which we talked about how God is inviting every single one of us into His throne room. We looked at Revelation chapter 3 and Revelation chapter 4, and then we looked through the entire book of Hebrews and laying a foundation scripturally, how sound it is that God is inviting us. He's inviting you and He's inviting me personally to enter into His throne room whenever we would desire. That this is our inheritance. And I really want to encourage you, if you haven't checked it out, look at the first session, because that's just so foundational to everything that we're looking at as we dive into God's throne room here. Above everything else, that you would have the confidence that you, whenever you would desire, can enter into His throne room. Now, we looked at Revelation chapter 3 and Revelation chapter 4, and we looked through the book of Hebrews and how foundational it is to the writer of Hebrews, and how clear it is seen in Revelation 3 and 4 that we are all called up through the open door in Revelation 4:1. One thing I forgot to mention was this isn't just a theme in Revelation, nor in the book of Hebrews. This is a theme that was pretty profound in the writings of Paul. And I'm just going to give you guys 3 references, just if you guys are looking into this. Ephesians 2:6 says, "We are seated with Christ in heavenly places." Colossians chapter 3, verse 1 through 3. And Philippians chapter 3, verse 20. Okay, and those are all speaking of present tense realities as believers, that our inheritance is not in the age to come, but here and now, that we have access of experientially, that we can access the throne room of God, and we can have immediate and direct presence with our Father who is in heaven. And so I want to encourage you guys, if you haven't checked that out, check that out. But in this session here, I want to kind of build off of a lot of what we talked about in the last session, and I'm going to make a lot of references back to Hebrews chapter 8 and Hebrews chapter 9. But this session here, we are I'm titling Thinking Rightly About Heaven. Okay? Thinking rightly about heaven. And I'm building off of a lot of what we talked about in the last session. And I'm still not going to fully go into Revelation 4 and really dig into the throne room yet. I want to lay a solid foundation for really looking at the profound things that we see in Revelation 4 and the other throne room visions. Okay. Now, in this session, we're going to look at all which I call the 5 throne room visions. And so the apostles and the prophets had in the scriptures. And we're going to look real briefly at all 5 of them. But when I say thinking rightly about heaven, what I mean is a lot of individuals and a lot of really great Bible people that I know have this idea of the throne room, like in Revelation chapter 4 and Isaiah 6, and just all of the different throne room visions that we're going to look at today. And they have this idea of these visions as if they're just dreams. Okay, so you go to sleep, your mind's just kind of throwing a bunch of images together, and you wake up and you're like, okay, maybe the Lord would speak to you in a dream or whatever, but that wasn't a reality. Okay, God used some images and some thoughts in your mind, and He spoke to you in that way. And I have a lot of friends who think of the throne room as if it's just kind of like a dream. Okay, it's just an analogy or a metaphor. It's only symbolism. Is God really seated on a throne? Of course not. It just speaks of His rule and His reign over His creation. Are there really 7 torches of fire before His throne? No, it speaks of something else. And in this session today, I'm really going to lay a solid foundation as we continue on in Revelation 4 and in Revelation 5, why it is that we are to think of this throne room as a real place. Okay, this is not a metaphor. It is not an analogy, and it's not a dream. God is really seated on a throne. He's really in a place. We talked a bit about this in the last session. Now we could talk about some other place in another geographic location. Again, I'm not saying heaven is a geographic location, but we're talking about another place here. A place that is real, a place that has substance to it. Now I don't really know what what the substance of heaven is like. I'm not saying heaven is made of wood and stone. Of course not. But the spiritual clearly has substance to it. And I don't know what the difference is between the substance of the physical versus the substance of the spiritual. But if they're similar or not. But I do know when you read the scriptures, the spiritual realm has much substance to it. For example, angels have wings. Okay, we often think of angels as like holograms, something we could just walk right through, or they could just teleport here and there. Angels have wings, which implies that they have to fly to places, that they have to get from point A to point B by flying. Okay, and that's just a logical understanding of angels. In this session, I want us to think about how this is a real place. Okay, now we're going to look, like I said, at these 5 visions, these 5 throne room visions. Okay, Revelation 4, Isaiah 6, Ezekiel 1, Daniel chapter 7, and Exodus 24. Okay, and I'm also going to tag along here 1 Enoch 14. Okay, not because I think it's authoritative, but I'm taking this on here for historical purposes, because this is a really great passage that shows us how the Jews thought about heaven. Okay, and it really relates a lot to these 5 other biblical throne room visions. And so again, I'm only going to be referring to that a few times here and a few times in some later sessions, only for historical purposes. Okay? Now, as we look through these 5 throne room visions, they're different. Each one is slightly different. But there's so much overlap between all 5 of them that you have to come to the conclusion that they're speaking of the same place, or these people are seeing the same place in the same reality. It's almost like when you think of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? And the 4 Gospels, and you look at just like one story in the Gospels, in all 4 of them that's recorded, you have a different vantage point, given from each writer. They're looking at the story from a different view. Okay, sometimes they say it differently because because of their audience who they're writing it to, and trying to give application there. But oftentimes, just even with John, for example, John was a young man when he was when he followed Christ, probably between 15 to 18 years old, and so he's viewing these events as a young 15, 16, even 17-year-old guy. And then you have Peter here, who is probably Mark's reference for the gospel, and he's viewing things as the eldest apostle at the time from this vantage point. And so they're seeing the same thing happen, the same event, but one from the vantage point of a young man, and one from the vantage point of an older man. Okay, and it's the same thing here. We have these 5 visions, and they all are speaking of the same reality, different vantage points. Again, and they're also given for application to different, or written to different people groups, again, right? Or a different context, most of the time the people of Israel. But they're all seeing it from a slightly different vantage point. Okay? But there's so much overlap between these visions. yeah, at the end of the day, you got to conclude, man, they are seeing, they're seeing the same place. All right. All right. Now let's begin here by looking at these throne room overlaps. Okay, and the first thing that we see out of these 5 throne room visions is we see out of 4 of them, Revelation 4, verse 2 and 3, Isaiah 6:1, Ezekiel chapter 126, and Daniel chapter 7 verse 9. They all include a throne. The only one that doesn't is Exodus 24. They all include a throne. Okay, and I'm gonna dive into this in the coming sessions on a session called the Thrones of God, because these revelations or these visions of these thrones, they're almost like God is sitting on different thrones. And I personally think he's on one throne, and that throne has different functions, and we're going to see the different functions, and we're really going to dive into them in the coming sessions. But nonetheless, all 4 out of these 5 visions, they all have a vision of God seated on a throne. Okay, in Revelation 4, verse 2 through 3, it says that there's an emerald rainbow surrounding his throne. Okay, now there's not too much description about the throne itself in Revelation 4, but it says around it is an emerald rainbow, something like an emerald rainbow. Okay, now this is very similar to the throne in Ezekiel chapter 1. Okay, in Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 26, it says that there is a sapphire throne, and one who sat on it like who had a human appearance. Okay, and then he goes on in verse 26, he says, he's talking about the glory around, or the light that is around the man on the throne, and so of course the throne itself. And he says, the likeness of the appearance of a bow in the cloud on the day of rain. Okay, so again, the brightness in Ezekiel chapter 1, he around the throne, he's relating it to a rainbow. Okay, very similar to the Revelation 4 rainbow around his throne. Okay, we move on here, and we see in Daniel chapter 7, it says that the throne has wheels. All right. Daniel chapter 7 is crazy. He's like, the throne's on fire and its wheels are on fire. You're thinking, a throne that has wheels? Okay, and we're going to spend a whole session on this throne here, which is, theologians call it the chariot throne, which basically means it's a movable throne. Okay, but the throne having wheels on it. Now, when we look at the Ezekiel 1 throne, which is also referenced to in Ezekiel chapter 10 verse 1 as well, both in Ezekiel chapter 1 and Ezekiel 10, it's a crazy vision. Just read it, you'll understand why it's so confusing and everything. There's a sapphire throne, there are the 4 living creatures, the cherubim, and then it describes wheels within wheels. So you have the throne, you have the cherubim, and then there are these wheels within wheels, okay? And it's kind of similar, and I'm going to spend a lot more time in connecting Ezekiel chapter 1 with Daniel chapter 7 with God's chariot throne, but there are wheels in this throne room scene, okay? Now, when we look historically, again, at 1 Enoch 14 verse 18, we see Enoch describes the throne of God as having wheels. And kind of interestingly, he says they're shining like the sun. Okay. Now, again, what that tells us, not that that's authoritative, but what that tells us is the Jews had a common understanding of God's throne as having wheels on it. Okay. So we see the overlap between Daniel 7, Ezekiel 1, and then also overlap of the way that the Jews thought historically. Now, like I said, Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 26, and Ezekiel chapter 10, verse 1 describes something like a sapphire throne. And I think that's one of the coolest revelations of the throne. Man, I would love to see the throne like a sapphire. There's not a whole lot of overlap within the biblical text with this throne. But again, like when we look at the throne in 1 Enoch 14:18, he describes the throne as ice. And again, you see in the biblical revelation and the historic understanding, you see a bit of overlap there as well. So this was a common understanding of the throne. Okay, and then lastly, when we come to Isaiah chapter 6, verse 1, Isaiah doesn't spend much time describing the throne, kind of similar to Revelation chapter 4, its appearance. But what he does say is he says it's high and lofty. Okay, and again, going back to 1 Enoch 14:18, that's one of the descriptions about the throne. It was a lofty throne. Okay, and so again, you see the biblical revelation overlapping with the historical understanding. Okay, this was a common understanding of what the throne was like. And again, we're going to look at all of these throne visions in just real great detail. But for now, just seeing the different overlaps between the thrones. Okay, and again, each prophet or the Apostle John, they're seeing it from this vantage point or from that vantage point. All right, and so they're looking at it from a different facet. Okay, when we look at Revelation chapter 4, verse 4, what we see is around the throne are 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones are 24 elders. Okay, so we see that there are multiple thrones within the throne room that aren't God's throne. Okay, now that's a mystery in and of itself. But what we see is in Daniel chapter 7, verse 9, he says thrones were placed. Again, thrones, plural. All right? And now in Daniel 7, he doesn't give a specific number of the thrones or anything, but he does say that there are numerous thrones. There are more than one throne surrounding his throne. It doesn't say surrounded, but it says that there are thrones. Okay? And again, you see an overlap there. You see multiple thrones in God's throne room in both visions. Okay? Now, when it comes to Revelation 4:4 with the 24 elders, we don't really have any references of elders in God's throne room other than when you look at Exodus chapter 24, verse 9 through 11, where it says that the 70 elders of Israel, they went up halfway up the mountain, and they were underneath God and beheld God's feet. Okay? Now, in trying to make a parallel between Exodus 24 and Revelation 4:4 with the elders, you're really stretching it. I really think like that's a real stretch, but there could be some overlap there, right? Okay. Now we kind of move on here, and in Revelation chapter 4, he continues on in verse 6, and he describes something like a sea of glass, like crystal. Okay, before the throne is a sea of glass. Now this is speaking of the floor of the throne room. Okay, underneath God's feet, underneath his throne, is a sea of glass. Now you gotta think, that just sounds so spectacular, right? To think of a sea like glass, sparkling like crystal, like that. I mean, just to think of that and to consider that is just an astonishing thought right there. Okay. Well, when we look at the 70 elders who went up halfway up the mountain, Mount Sinai, it says that they were underneath God. Okay, they were beneath Him. But this is what it says. They described something like a pavement. Now this is describing what is underneath God. Okay, and underneath God. Okay, and this is above them. Okay, they describe a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven like the very heaven for clearness. Okay, that's very similar to the sea of glass. And so they're seeing the pavement or the floor of the throne room. And then in Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 22, he describes something very similar. Now this is, he describes the cherubim underneath the throne, and then the throne that is above them. And then he describes this expanse that is beneath the throne, okay, but is above the cherubim. And he describes this expanse, he says, the likeness of the expanse was like shining, like awe-inspiring crystal. Okay, a shining expanse, awe-inspiring crystal, just like the sea of glass in Revelation 4:6, that is like crystal. Okay, very almost identical language there. But again, describing the floor of the throne room, very similar, like a sea of glass, like a sapphire stone, or like a clear expanse, sparkling. Okay, very similar descriptions. You just see three overlaps right there. And then when we come in Revelation chapter 4, verse 6 through 9, John describes seeing four living creatures. Okay, now these creatures are crazy. I'm really looking forward to talking about them in a lot more detail. But he says there are four of them. Okay. And they have eyes all around. Okay. And within. So externally he sees eyes. And I don't know how, but he knows that they've got eyes on the inside of them as well. They each have 6 wings. And there are 4 of them. And each of them have a different face. One with the face of a lion, one with the face of an ox, one with the face of a man, one with the face of an eagle, like an eagle in flight. And according to Revelation 4:8, it says that they never cease to say, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who is, who was, and who is to come." Okay, now when we look at the throne room of the throne room vision of Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah describes something very similar. But he describes above the throne are what he calls seraphim. Okay, in Isaiah 6 verse 2 through 3, he describes them. The name seraphim, the title seraphim, means burning ones, and so kind of a different vantage point. He sees them burning in Isaiah 6, and then in Revelation he sees them as having eyes. So slightly different again, right? But they both, in both encounters, in both visions, they both have 6 wings. Okay? But what really connects the Isaiah 6 angelic beings with the Revelation 4 living creatures is the song that they sing. In Isaiah 6:3, it says that they say, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." Okay, the song is almost identical to what the living creatures in Revelation 4 verse 8 sing. There is no other place in the scriptures where that song, "Holy, holy, holy," is recorded. And so you see massive overlaps right there. Now when you look at Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 5 through 22, Ezekiel describes 4 living creatures also. Now, these living creatures, they are very similar to the Revelation 4 creatures. And again, we're going to talk about the difference between all these three visions with these angelic beings. But he says there are 4, which is the same number of creatures that are in the book of Revelation. Okay, and he says that each of them have 4 different faces. Okay, now the 4 faces that the living creatures in Revelation 4 have are the same faces of the 4 living creatures in Ezekiel chapter 1. But the difference is each one has all 4 faces. Now, it's kind of crazy to think of it. So like you got a face of a man facing you, a face of a lion here, a face of an ox here, and a face of an eagle here on each of them. Okay? Kind of crazy. But he describes them a bit different than the Revelation 4 vision and the Revelation 4 living creatures. He says they only have 4 wings. Rather than Revelation 4, they have 6 wings. Okay? Now he continues on, and in Ezekiel chapter 10, verse 1, he says, he calls them cherubim. So this is a description of the cherubim. So I personally think these are different creatures, but again, you see different overlaps between the Isaiah 6 and Revelation 4 and Ezekiel 1, and enough overlap to say that there is a throne in heaven. There are multiple thrones around him. The floor of the throne room is like a sapphire or a sea of glass. And before him are angelic creatures that are worshiping, saying, "Holy, holy, holy." Guys, these guys are seeing the same scene. This isn't a vision, this isn't an analogy, but this is over the span of thousands of years. One man sees one thing, another man sees the same scene, another man sees the same scene. They are seeing the same place in the same reality, guys. Now, I want us to transition from looking at the throne room visions of the Bible, and I want us to look for a time at the tabernacle and the temple, the earthly temple and the earthly tabernacle. Okay, and now I'm gonna just stay with me here for a couple minutes here, because this is gonna really make sense and really connect to the throne room visions in the Bible that we just looked at. Okay, in Exodus 19, we made reference to this in the last session, at Mount Sinai and the significance of Sinai. Okay. It says in Exodus 19 verse 20 that Moses went up to the top of the mountain. He alone went up to the top of the mountain. Okay, the 70 elders, what we talked about in Exodus 24, they went up halfway, and Moses was the only one who went all the way up, okay, and personally encountered God. Okay, now what happened in Exodus 19 when he went up to Mount Sinai? Okay, what transpired there is very profound. Okay, now this is the place where Moses received the revelation for the tabernacle, which will later become the temple. All right, now in Hebrews chapter 8 verse 5, the writer is talking about the tabernacle here. He says they serve as copy or shadow, as a copy or a shadow of the heavenly things. Now, he's referring to this encounter here right now in Exodus 19, Mount Sinai. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, or you could translate that tabernacle, he was instructed by God saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown to you on the mountain." Now, a couple things I want to make reference to here. He says, the tabernacle, or the temple, it served as a copy and as a shadow of the heavenly things. Now, what are these heavenly things? Is this just some vague thing? Is it just an idea that God brought up and said, "Hey guys, take this, do this, this would be a cool idea"? What are the heavenly things? Okay, now, the writer of Hebrews describes this a lot more, in a lot more detail, in Hebrews 9:24, and again we made reference to this in the previous session quite a few times. He says, "For Christ entered not into the holy places made by hands." Okay, that is talking about the earthly tabernacle. All right, and again he uses the identical language that he uses in chapter 8 verse 5, and he says, "Which are copies of the true things." Okay, Hebrews 8:5. These are copies and shadows of the heavenly things. And Hebrews 9:24, which are copies of the true things. Okay, and it continues on, but into heaven itself. Okay, what he says here is that Christ has ascended not into the earthly tabernacle, but he has ascended into the true tabernacle in heaven. The things that are copies and shadows. He has ascended into heaven itself. And what that tells us is that the copies and the shadows, or the tabernacle as it's called, a copy or a shadow, they were copies and they were shadowing heaven itself. Okay, now when we connect this back to Hebrews chapter 8 verse 5, and it says, when God says to Moses, see that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown to you on the mountain. The pattern that was shown to him was the very throne room. Do you see that? Moses was taken into the throne. Either he was taken into the throne room or he was shown the throne room. Okay. Now, again, I really want to lay this out and make this clear. This isn't my opinion. This isn't just my interpretation of Hebrews 8 and Hebrews 9. This is a very common interpretation of this passage. All right. Moses was seeing the throne room. And he was called to then make or to mirror or replicate, or as in the language of Hebrews 8 and Hebrews 9, to copy that on the earth. Okay? So when we look at the earthly tabernacle, again, and the tabernacle then becomes the temple. When we look at the earthly tabernacle, we are to see mirroring realities of the true heavenly tabernacle. And that's exactly what we're going to see. And so I want us to look for a moment here at the earthly tabernacle and temple. And I want us to see the parallels between what we just looked at with the throne room and what Moses erected on the earth. Okay, the first thing that we see, as we see in Exodus 25 verse 37, we see that Moses was commanded to place 7 golden lampstands in the tabernacle. Okay? 7 golden lampstands. In Revelation chapter 4 verse 5 it says, and before the throne are 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. So you have 7 torches of fire in heaven, 7 lampstands, golden lampstands, in the earthly tabernacle. Okay? In Exodus 27, verse 1 through 8, Moses was commanded, and he saw, and it was told to establish an altar on the earth, in the tabernacle. In Isaiah chapter 6, verse 6, and Revelation 6, verse 9, we see in God's throne room is an altar. Okay? So Moses, he saw an altar in heaven, and he was commanded to put an altar on the earth. In Exodus 25, verse 19 through 22, it is described that the Ark of the Covenant, above the Ark of the Covenant, are 2 cherubim. Okay? Their wings are overshadowing the mercy seat, or the Ark of the Covenant. Now, throughout the many descriptions of God's throne, he's often described as enthroned above the cherubim. We're going to look at a lot more references to that in the coming sessions. But especially in Ezekiel chapter 1, in Ezekiel chapter 10, we see that there are living cherubim underneath the throne of God. Okay? So there are living cherubim in heaven, in the heavenly tabernacle, and there are statue cherubim that are established in the earthly tabernacle. Let's continue on. Now the tabernacle is developed over the years, and when David becomes king, he establishes a new reality to the earthly tabernacle, or the tabernacle of Moses. Now, I'm not going to get into the details here, but there are 2 specific places in the Bible where we can see that David saw the heavenly throne room, okay, where he saw the heavenly sanctuary. Now, what he saw in the heavenly sanctuary, and what was unique to the tabernacle of David, was the continual aspect of worship. According to Revelation 4 verse 8, it says that the 4 living creatures, they never cease to say, holy, 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 never cease. And then whenever the 4 living creatures give glory and honor and thanks. The 24 elders fall down, okay, before him who is seated on the throne. So the 4 living creatures worship him day and night, as well as the 24 elders. So there's continuous day and night worship happening around God's throne. And David, he saw that, and under the direction and the governing of God, he was commanded to introduce that to the tabernacle. So he established continual worship on the earth, just as it is in heaven. David made instructions for his son Solomon after his death, that Solomon would build the temple, because God's desire was not for there to be a tabernacle. Tabernacle simply means tent, a place that was, they could move it from one place to another place to another place. It wasn't permanent. God desired a permanent dwelling among the people of Israel, and so they built the temple. Okay. Now, when Solomon built the temple, there are 3 main parallels we can see to heaven. Okay. It says in 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 17 through 18, that the foundations of the temple was constructed and built upon costly gemstones. Kind of an odd thing to do, right? Why would they do that? Why would David instruct Solomon to do that? Well, because he probably saw the heavenly city in Revelation 21, verse 19 through 20, where it says the foundations of the city are costly stones, gemstones. And those gemstones are the 12 gemstones that were on the breastplate of the high priest. So the temple was built on costly stones. Why? Because the heavenly temple was built on costly stones. And I don't know what that means, what the implications of that are in the heavenly temple, but we just see that. We see it mirrored on the earth as well. Okay, in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 20 through 22, it describes that the interior of the temple was overlaid with gold. Okay, which was a common thing. But when we look, when seeing temples in the ancient world, but when we look at Revelation chapter 21 and verse 18 and verse 21, verse 18 and verse 21, we see that the heavenly city is made of pure gold. The city is gold, the heavenly city is gold, the temple was made of gold. And then lastly, we could say, when looking at the odd usage of the palm trees in the sanctuary of the temple, which is kind of odd, there's all these palm trees in the temple, that could very well be a reference to Revelation 22, verse 1 through 2, where it describes the Garden of Eden being in heaven itself. Okay? So you have a garden in heaven, and you have a garden in the sanctuary on the earth. And so right there you see, those are 7 firm copies, if we could say that according to Hebrews, copies or shadows of the true heavenly things. And so guys, in doing this, I just really want to establish a foundation before we dive into Revelation 4 and Revelation 5. This is a real place. This isn't a metaphor. This isn't an analogy. When I say that God is inviting us into His throne room, I'm not saying something vague. He's inviting us into a real place where He actually dwells. He actually is enthroned seated on a throne. There's actually a sea of glass. There are 7 torches blazing like fire. There are creatures that would just knock your socks off. There are just realities there, like elders and thrones and things that we just can't even comprehend, but it's a real place, guys. And as we go through the throne room scenes, and as we develop these things, I want to create a clear picture for what is happening around God's throne, because He is inviting you into that reality.